Hello, welcome back to our study in the book of James. I do hope you're enjoying it. I enjoy the book of James myself as we've gone through this book, and James uses these illustrations and a very practical guide to the Christian life and to guide us. It's a wealth of information anytime we open the Bible, but I do thoroughly enjoy the book of James. And we're moving now into chapter 5, and in this chapter, there's a condemnation against the rich, especially those responsible for the death of Christ, as we see in verse 6 of chapter 5. And we see a warning against their end in the first 6 verses, similar to Jesus' pronouncement against Jerusalem. Paul also, in Acts chapter 28, in verses 25 through 28, he gives a similar pronouncement. Now, we also see no call for repentance for those who have already reached the point that they will not return to God. And the time had come for judgment against Israel. And James adopts the stern language of some of the Old Testament prophets. And while addressed to those of the day, there is a warning here to those today who would attempt to gain their wealth at the expense of others. It is also a warning to those who would be Christians, as they are not exempt from temptation. Many times we think that when we become a Christian that life just becomes, just a bed of roses, and that's not true. We still face the same difficulties, the same temptations, sometimes the same poverties or trials. The difference, though, is in the Christian's attitude and understanding of the greater scheme of life and the life beyond this one. James, more than any other, points out the crucifixion of the Savior that was due to selfishness and hatred among the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. Now, these attitudes are why Jesus twice cleansed the temple. Their conduct in the temples also played into Jesus' teachings, and James gives more insight into their robbing and cheating. The following verses give inspiration to the Christians to be patient for the Lord to avenge wrongs and to execute justice on the wrongdoers, as we see in verses 7 through 12. We see more than just social injustice. The rich in question are the unjust persecutors of the Christians, as was seen in James chapter 2, verses 6 through 7. So now we move into chapter 5, and verses 1 through 3, the rich are warned. In verse 1 saying, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you." The rich here are not Christians, although some may have been and had abandoned the faith for material things, but we see that there is no call to repentance. The weeping and howling are not for forgiveness, but in view of the judgment coming upon them, and expressed as certain, like the Old Testament prophecies. And this would be in view of the final judgment when each shall receive their due. Those addressed being those who have hardened their hearts and were unmindful of God. Some, even like James 4:13, who also not only disregarded God, but they even boasted of themselves. I'm reminded of an occasion I had sitting and talking to a member, or 2 members of the church, a couple, and they had not been in services that Sunday, and they sat here and were laughing and joking how guests had showed up from out of town and they had gone kayaking instead of attending worship services, and just so unmindful of God, but even to the point of boasting about it. And I picture this verse when I think about that. And we see here that this judgment is coming upon them. In judgment to come, riches or poverty, they're going to avail us nothing. But it's going to be the manner in which we lived our lives in accordance with God. For those lost, this is cause to weep and then howl for eternity. The address here is not a call for the repentance, but to encourage the poor who are being persecuted by the rich that justice will be served. God always takes care of what is right. We may not always see it. It may not even be in our lifetime, but God will balance things out. We see the address is not to brethren, as was the case in chapter 4. and beginning again in verse 7 of this chapter. But here, this makes it applicable to those rich or who would desire to be rich. There is a pronouncement of woe to all who would abandon the faith for the pursuit of those things of the material world. Paul dealt with a similar case with an individual, a disciple by the name of Demas, who forsook him for this present world. These verses are not to say that riches make one wicked or that poverty makes one righteous. In fact, when we read the Bible, we read of those who were rich. Job, for instance, when we look to the Old Testament, or Abraham even. In the New Testament, we can even think of Lydia or Cornelius. Both were probably very well off financially. Barnabas was one who had property, who he sold it. What is concerned here, though, is attitudes and motivations behind each that affect salvation. How are the riches obtained? How are they being enjoyed? How are they being used? And we could tie this in with 1 Timothy chapter 6. But riches are often condemned in Scripture as those who are rich so often rely upon themselves and their riches and not upon God. We can look up certain verses like Proverbs 11:28 or Isaiah 5 and verse 8, Jeremiah 4 verse 8, and the list goes on, 1 Timothy 6:19. There's a warning not against wealth. Even in 1 Timothy 6:10, and it talks about it's the love of money that is the root of all evil. It's probably one of the most misquoted verses because people take this to mean that money is evil. Money is not evil or good. It's our acts and intentions in using it and obtaining it. In verse 2, James says, "Your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten." And James denotes whose riches are corrupted? Yours, as riches are not corrupt. Again, 1 Timothy 6 verse 10. Riches, as used here, are also referring to those who have an overflow of such and the wrong attitude in their use. It's not money or property that is corrupt, but the attitude and how they were obtaining and using those riches. Paul helps in showing the proper use of riches. He says to the church in Ephesus, when we read Ephesians 4 verse 28, "Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good," and here is the caveat, "that he may have something to give to him who has need." In speaking to the disciples, Jesus said, "How hard is it for those who have riches to enter the kingdom of God?" And the disciples were astonished at his words. But Jesus answered again and said to them, "Children, how hard is it for those who trust in riches to enter the kingdom of God?" Mark 10, verses 23 and 24. Those spoken of here by James were such, they were already corrupted and rotten spiritually. Their garments, those items they wore in public to show off their wealth, would all one day be moth-eaten. It is inevitable that clothes wear out, just as the human body will one day wear out. And in the end, it will not matter how finely you adorned yourself, but what is your inner man like? And that James says their riches were corrupt and their garments were moth-eaten, it was a picture of their spiritual condition before God. In verse 3, he says, "Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures in the last days." Notice James uses the things that people would usually accumulate and count as value. One of the things that today in our own society, storage units, these self-storage, they make billions of dollars a year because people have accumulated things they can't even use, and they just heap them up, and then they have to find places to store them. All of these things are susceptible to age and corrosion. James uses these figuratively to describe the character of those trusting in such riches and its effect upon their character. And while gold and silver do not rust, it is representative, again, of their abundance and lack of use, as they did not need it. Again, we looked at 1 Timothy 6, and in the latter part of that, I believe it's about verses 16 and 17, there is a warning to the rich to the proper use of riches. There's an allusion to the Sadducees here, that while men would mix the base alloys into gold and silver, they had mixed that which was impure into their hearts as they had deceitfully acquired their riches. Their own riches were a testimony then against them. As they could see the signs of misuse or improper use upon their robes and gold, the same would be their eventual outcome. They would suffer destruction in the final judgment, just as their goods were being destroyed. To eat their flesh like fire is a metaphor, as the woes to come upon them were the result of their love for wealth they had fraudulently acquired. Their goods rusted and moth-eaten, a sign of their disuse, and the sin of mishandling their riches. Their sin being the hoarding, the coming from greed, the avarice, the love of money. We cannot miss the Lord's parable of the foolish man who was building up stores for the future that he may take it easy, but was in reality storing up wrath in the day of judgment. Now, there's nothing wrong with planning for one's future, having a retirement fund, but we also have to remember that anything beyond what we need, it should be used to glorify God. A gentleman by the name of Prunchard, he declared that the wages of the traitor, the spoil of the thief, and the wealth of the oppressor burn the hands that clasp them. Memories of the wrongs shiver through each guilty soul like fire. And that was his reference to this verse. The last days were upon them, as we have been in the last days since Christ arose. For those addressed in the letter, the coming destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans was about to come. At this time, their wealth would no more save them as it will in the final judgment. James again shows an echoing of Jesus' teachings when we look to the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 6, and starting in verse 20, Jesus said, "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And is it not so true? Is it not befitting? Where our heart is, that's usually where our treasure is. And where our treasure is, that's where our heart is. The question is, what is in our heart? What is it that we are treasuring? Is it the material things that rust and destroy and just will tatter and be no more? Or is it the spiritual things that will serve us for eternity? Now, in verses 4 through 6, James addresses the sins of the rich. And beginning in verse 4, he says, "Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." Here, James speaks of those who would be farmhands, those harvesting the fields for wages. These would be the fields of the rich person, getting richer from the produce of those fields at the expense of others' labor. This also identifies us as Jerusalem or Judea, as other parts of the world at this time generally used slaves, and the hire of laborers was characteristic of Judea. While there's nothing wrong with making a profit, the question remains, how did one obtain it? Here, despite whatever pay was promised to those laborers, the field owner would defraud them, finding some excuse to not pay them or to not pay them in full. In the Old Testament, we read in Leviticus 19 and verse 13, "You shall not cheat your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning." We can compare Jeremiah 22 verse 13 and Malachi 3 verse 5 with this. The law of Moses was clear about misuse of the poor, and James shows how the law had come to be disregarded. We see it was not just the rejection of Christ that aroused the Lord's judgment, but also the rebellion against his very laws. We see that the cries of the poor may not be heard by the rich, but God hears. This is seen many times in Scripture. God hears the cries of the oppressed. God will keep an accounting for the last day when each will be paid their due, whether good or bad. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10 telling us, that we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ to answer for the things done in the body, whether good or bad. That's an individual accounting that each one of us will have to face. Also, while the employer had an obligation to the laborer, the laborer has an obligation to give to the employer as well. You need to give your employer a fair day's wage or a fair day's work for your wage. You have to work for your agreed upon wages. And Paul writes more about this in his epistle to the church in Colossae, in Colossians 3, verses 22 through 25, and in chapter 4 and verse 1. You know, I remember being at one of these fast food restaurants, and the attitude of the girl taking my order was, basically, I'm here, and what more do you want? And so you have entered into a contract with your employer, you've agreed upon wages, and you are to provide a specific service in return for those wages. And this girl, and I heard her talking and with another coworker, and basically she had the attitude that just showing up then was deserving of being paid. But that's not the agreement I'm sure that she had when she sat down and interviewed and was hired for that position. And so we have to remember, not only does our employer have an obligation to pay us a fair wage, but we have an obligation to provide a fair day's labor for that wage. Now, Sabaoth here, meaning host or armies, and that God is the Lord of hosts. Now, this is a term denoting might, power, glory. Those who have no one to defend them here on earth, they have someone who commands the armies in heaven and who does guarantee justice in the end. Now, in verse 5, James says, "You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter." This refers to the way they had lived, taking advantage of every earthly pleasure. This was a life of extravagance, of wanton waste, sowing to the flesh, and they were contributing nothing back to society. This was achieved by defrauding others, such as the laborers in the fields. This is not to say that enjoying finer things in life is sinful, but it is the way in which it was gained and used that was sinful. The fact that we have creates us an obligation to add or to share something back to the world. I have a very good friend of mine, and he is in a position that he has been financially well blessed. And he understands verses like these and like 1 Timothy 6. And he makes sure that he gives back in a fair proportion to what God has given him. And that's one thing we always have to remember. We have this idea sometimes of achievement, that we've gone out and we've done something, we've earned something. But ultimately we have to remember that all comes from God. All is a blessing from our Creator. And we are to be good stewards of the things that God has given us. We have to remember that. Here, that they had nourished themselves for slaughter has in mind livestock that have fattened up before and right up to the time of butchering. And the day of slaughter in here being the day of judgment. James' language is reminiscent of Amos when we read Amos chapter 6 and verses 1 through 6. And even when we think about Job 21 and verse 23. Those living such lives consider themselves wise, but in reality, such a life is one that is not wise in regards to our eternal destiny. Again, we see the characteristics and the attitudes of those living such lives are not going to be able to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And then in verse 6, he says, "You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you." And this verse may seem out of place, but it's not. We see the poor were being neglected, and it seemed they were being overlooked by the Lord. James mentions those innocent and who are meek. There's a reminder here to Jesus. In Isaiah 53 in verse 7, it says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearer is silent, so he opened not his mouth." And in Acts 8:32 we could think of. And this here in Isaiah is a prophecy of the Messiah. And condemned here has the idea of a formal trial, where the innocent poor were often not afforded a fair trial. They didn't get a fair deal. Many times the decision was already made, sometimes through bribery. While they did not usually kill the poor literally, they had beaten them down and effectively killed their spirit. Often it was the rich who were able to persuade the courts in their favor. This was a mockery of justice, that one's fate was determined even before the trial had taken place. There is similarity to Jesus' trial, where they literally killed Christ. He did not resist, and they cannot escape the judgment to come for what they had done. Likewise, those rich who oppress the poor will also not escape the judgment to come upon them. The just can be seen as Christ or any other righteous man in comparison to the wicked. This was and is an ongoing problem. And all of those through the ages who act such are guilty and share in the guilt. Matthew 23 and verses 29 through 35 is another place to look at, to read. And while the Bible does not condemn wealth, it certainly impresses upon us the responsibility and the proper handling that comes with wealth, and calls for social justice. Similar was James' warning about not many teachers, not saying we should not teach, but to be responsible in handling the Word of God. We need to be responsible in handling, again, what God has given us. James's terminology here certainly also shows not only his understanding of Jesus' teachings, but is in keeping with many messianic prophecies of the Christ. In verses 7 through 9 now, James turns to the subject of patience and the Lord's return. In verse 7, he says, "Therefore be patient, brethren." Now we're returning to brethren. "Until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain." And James, again, he's now returning to brethren and addressing those who have been unjustly treated, and encourages them to be patient. Be patient, because when the Lord returns, all wrongs will be made right, and the just will be vindicated. You know, I think of in Revelation, the martyrs under the altar, and they ask, "How long, Lord?" There was no doubt that the Lord would take and set things right. Their only question was, well, how long? When will this occur? In the very near context of our chapter here in James, the destruction of Jerusalem was coming, and those suffering persecution currently at the hands of the rich leading class would be saved. When Jerusalem was destroyed, we think of Matthew 24 or Mark 13, Luke 21, when we think about Jerusalem being destroyed, not a single Christian was lost, as they had all been warned to leave. Now, in the remote context, those generations who are patient and endure till Christ returns, being warned of the judgment to come, will also be saved. You see, they will take preparation and make the necessary arrangements so that they will be in the proper position when Christ returns, just like those who listened, left Jerusalem, and were not there when it was destroyed. Christ's return being spoken of in more than 1,000 references, either directly or indirectly. You think about Matthew 24, verse 3, Mark 13 in verses 33 through 37, or 1 Thessalonians 2 in verse 19, and 2 Peter 3 in verse 4. Patient, in the word used here, it means long-spirited, forbearing, patient, suffer or suffer long, be long-suffering, endure. This is also not the same word for patient that James used in chapter 1, verse 3, where there is reference to things. Here it refers to persons. While we are to endure the things of life that produce the character of patience, here James refers to the patience of knowing a time of justice is coming for those persecuted. Paul wrote in a similar way to the church in Thessalonica in 2 Thessalonians 1, 3 through 10. James then draws attention to the comparison of the farmer who patiently accepts God's timing for the harvest and the rain. The farmer is well aware that in order to receive the earth's produce, he must patiently wait for it to come in its own due time, which God has appointed, and we need to trust in God. The early and latter rains refers to the rain in autumn and in spring, with a 6-month interval between them, where the farmer needs patiently to wait. There's also a thought of the early and latter rain being prophetic and referring to God's harvest of the earth. The early rain being those Christians gathered before the destruction of Jerusalem, and those latter gathered through the evangelism of the world before Christ's second coming. There seems to be some support to this, as Jesus in the parable of the tares, when we read Matthew 13, verse 38, he says, "The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the wicked one." And we could also look to Joel 2, verse 23, or Joel 2, 28 through 32, as were quoted in Acts 2, verse 21. In verse 8, James now says, "You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand." James, having told the brethren to be patient like the farmer, turns to the judgment. Our reward is far greater than any of that of the farmer, so we can be even more patient. We need not to worry over the difficulties of life. Now, worry and concern, these are two different things. Concern takes note of and makes preparation and plans for. Worry does nothing but worry and causes us sickness. While this is not the same, again, as being concerned, because that means making plans, we need to realize, like the farmer, that all will be accomplished in God's good time, and therefore not worry and be unfruitful. The patience here is uncertain as to whether James had in view the coming destruction of Jerusalem or to the second coming of Christ. Either is applicable, as it would have a direct relation to his hearers in both circumstances. Not that James foresaw the second coming as being soon. Even Peter and Paul did not see the Lord's return as being in their lifetimes, but yet some future unknown time, when we think about 2 Peter 1, 12 through 15. And James says to establish your hearts, meaning to turn resolutely in a certain direction, steadfastly set, strengthen. We need to set ourselves firmly on the course we have chosen as Christians, knowing it is not an easy way. Jesus even telling us of the wide and narrow road in Matthew 7 and 13 and 14. He says, "Narrow and difficult is the way." We establish our hearts through faith, the assurance of the life we've chosen, based on the evidence God provides to us of keeping his promises. James will later say in verse 11, "Indeed, we count them blessed who endure." And Jesus in Matthew 24, verse 13, saying, "But he who endures to the end shall be saved." And James then refers again to the coming of the Lord. And the word used here for coming, meaning being near, advent, often return, especially to Christ to punish Jerusalem, or finally the wicked, and by implication physically or presence. Christ's coming was so certain that it was regarded as near at hand. However, James did not mean that Christ's second coming was expected as very soon, or even in his lifetime, as we've mentioned, as no one knows that day and hour. Matthew 24, verses 36 to 39. Isaiah writes, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It will come as a destruction from the Almighty." In Isaiah 13, verse 6. Isaiah, like many prophecies, had direct and indirect meaning. The direct meaning was the destruction of Babylon, still almost 200 years to come from his writing, but also would speak of the prophetic Babylon of Revelation 14, verse 8, and eternal judgment. The fact that Jesus could return at any time calls for us to be in a constant state of readiness. Think about the Lord talking about being at the door and knocking. Imagine just that close. At any time could be there, open the door, and there he is. And we do not know the hour or the time of his second coming, and therefore we need to always be ready. We need to be living our life in such a way that if Jesus was to appear right now, or some act was to take my life right now, that I would be prepared for eternity. Now in James chapter 5, verse 9, James says, "Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." Having spoken of patience towards those outside the body of Christ, James now admonishes the brethren not to grumble against one another. Due to oppression by the rich, it is easy to grumble and complain within ourselves or to one another, especially if no relief seems to be near in coming. Those grumbling often have negative attitudes that manifest quarrelsome attitudes. They end up quarrelsome toward others, toward one another, toward their own brethren. This is not good. It is easy to grumble and complain, but this should not be the attitude of a Christian. The danger comes from being condemned for such attitude that often manifests in our actions and words. The tongue, already something James has addressed. Those grumbling were judging others as guilty for their woes, and as such were judging unfairly and cruelly. There is a definite allusion here to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount where he warned, "Judge not that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you." Matthew 7, verses 1 and 2. And again, Jesus does not condemn judging, but the manner in which it was being done. James then declares that the judge is standing at the door, being the judge mentioned in James 4, verse 12, and that being Christ. At the door, it indicates his nearness to us to see and closeness to execute judgment. The meaning is that judgment, while future, is certain and can come at any moment. Similar language is found in Revelation 3 and verse 20 with the warning to the church in Laodicea, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." All grumbling and murmuring therefore needs to be put away from us, as Christ can at any time enter without advance notice and find us guilty. There's even that idea of somebody standing behind the door that we can hear what you're doing, what you're saying on the other side of the door. And Jesus is standing there. James, having already assured his hearers that the Lord will come in good time and set all right all wrongs, ministering justice, and we need not to fall short in ourselves of preparing for that return and be judged ourselves among the wicked. That concludes our lesson for today. We will pick up in verse 10 in our next lesson. I so appreciate you being here, and I encourage you to continue reading your Bible. Read ahead. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us here at the Midway Church of Christ. Remember, God loves you, and so do I.